Chapter 8 The Odd Sisters' Cake. It had been a long journey by horse-drawn carriage from Morningstar Kingdom to the Dead Woods, which the Odd Sisters called home. But as luck would have it, James found a small bakery along the way, with the silliest of names. Tittlebottom's and Butterpants's Bakery sat on the outskirts of a lovely little kingdom, surrounded by golden flowers that glowed in the dusky twilight. The names Tittlebottom and Butterpants rang a bell in his memory, but he couldn't then recall why. He was exhausted from his journey by sea, and now by carriage, and he was feeling a bit punchy, and all he could do was laugh at the names and the series of events that had befallen him since he'd dived into the ocean after his friend. In the near distance, he spied a lonely and crumbling tower that grew out of the forest. As they passed through the kingdom, he remembered the stories Skylights had told him, that it used to be home, or prison really, to a woman who was now queen of this hamlet when she was a young girl. Skylights told him the strangest stories about the many kings, and queens of the various kingdoms in this land. This one, it seems, had magical hair, and she was held captive in that tower by a witch who'd wished to use the young girl's hair to bring her sisters back to life. Sisters by the name of Primrose and Hazel. The way Skylights had described the events, it was all rather macabre. The idea of wrapping a little girl's hair around the dead bodies of her sisters in hopes of raising them from the dead. As James traveled the length of the many kingdoms, the stories Skylights told him rang in his ears. Evil curses, haunted mirrors, beauties who fell in love with beasts, trees that could walk and talk, and now witches who dealt in necromancy, and not just witches, but generations of them who ruled over the very place he was about to visit. But in that moment, it was his task to procure for his hosts a cake. And it seemed the bakery with the laughable name was closed, and he didn't know what he would do. James could see through the window that this was no ordinary bakery. It had the most divine cakes he had ever seen. Cases and cases of them in all manner of design and flavors. He hardly knew what he would choose. What sort of cake do identical witch sisters like? But it seemed he would be showing up empty-handed. Bloody hell, of course it's closed. It's almost evening. Damnable bakers and their hours, said James. Then he saw a young woman inside the shop but puttering around, no doubt starting on her baking for the next day. Though he could hardly understand why when it looked as though she had already created so many beautiful cakes, and he wondered if she wasn't a poor soul from one of these fairy tales, cursed to continue baking or some other such nonsense. "Excuse me, good woman," said James, tapping on the window. "Please, can't I just buy one of your delicious cakes? I will pay you handsomely." James rapped on the window harder and harder. Within moments, the jolly-looking woman made her way to the door and unlocked it. "May I help you?" she asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "You're not from around here, are you, sir?" James could see she was looking at his clothing and seemed to be taking measure of him, and decided she didn't know what to make of him. "No, good woman. I've just recently arrived in your magical kingdom. I'm sorry to disturb you. Are you Mrs. Tittlebottom? I'm looking to buy a cake. Perhaps the almond cake there in the window? I'm on my way to visit the Queer Sisters, and I don't want to show up without the cake they requested." James shoved coins into Mrs. Tittlebottom's hands, hoping it would persuade her, but she hardly noticed. She just looked at him as if she had seen a ghost. "Do you mean the Odd Sisters?" Mrs. Tittlebottom gave James the strangest look. He realized his choice of clothing was probably a misstep. His pirate gear would have probably gone over much better, seeing the way people dressed in these lands. It seemed to James they didn't dress much differently than they had in his own lands. But during more adequate times, So it was no wonder this woman was looking at him strangely. She had never seen clothing such as this. Yes, I suppose I do mean the odd sisters, said James, chuckling. At this point, he took delight in saying their names wrong. Something about it made him feel less nervous about meeting them. Are you sure it was the odd sisters you made this request? May I ask the manner in which you received it? She asked, squinting at James in a way that told him she didn't believe him. I'm quite sure, Mrs. Tittlebottom, and if you really must know, they sent the message with a crow. This made Tittlebottom's eyes grow large. Was she a delicate creature, with black feathers that shined blue and purple in the light? Did she seem otherworldly to you? Mrs. Tittlebottom seemed as if she was afraid of his answer. I'd say so, he said. Why do you ask? Is there something I should know about the odd sisters and their creature? Mrs. Tittlebottom smiled. There are a great many things you need to know about the odd sisters and their minions. However, we don't have time to discuss them now. Might I suggest our largest 6-layered cake, sir? The sisters' love of cakes is legendary, though I didn't know they were now in the position to order them, let alone eat them. James had the feeling this woman had a long history with the odd sisters, and there was some aspect about them requesting a cake that bothered her deeply. And then he realized why her name seemed so familiar to him when he first saw it on the bakery window. This young woman must have been the granddaughter of Mrs. Tittlebottom, the renowned baker who was once nanny to the queen in this kingdom. Hey? The very woman was terrorized by the odd old witch, with the help of the odd sisters, who was desperately trying to bring her sisters, Primrose and Hazel, back to life with the princess's magical hair. The poor girl they had locked away in a tower, the princess who had grown up to be queen of these lands. I don't wish to be impertinent, dear woman, but may I ask if you're related to the queen's nanny? You share the same name, and it doesn't seem like a common one to me. Mrs. Tittlebottom gave him a curious look. So you've been reading the Book of Fairy Tales? I imagine the ladies of the Deadwoods are very keen to have it back. I suppose that is why you are here. And to answer your question, I am the very same Mrs. Tittlebottom you recall from that terrifying and tangled story. But that is all I will say on the subject with a stranger. To be sure, I will be making a visit to the ladies of the Deadwoods to see how it is that the odd sisters are in a position to order cakes, let alone eat them. James found this woman very puzzling. She was clearly much younger than the woman in the story Skylights had told him. He wondered if everyone in the many kingdoms was so. You seem much too young to be the same woman, he said, not able to help himself. So I am. But there are many things about this place you don't yet understand. Magic so old it would take a lifetime to discover. I only know because I have lived several lifetimes thanks to the magic of these flowers, she said, glancing at the golden flowers that seemed to cover the entirety of the landscape in the many kingdoms. Now, how about that 6-layered cake we discussed? Shall I make it ready for you? She asked, her tone making it very clear she didn't wish to answer any more of his questions. 6 layers it is, then, he said, shaking his head. Tell me, are these freaky sisters as terrible as everyone says? He found himself lowering his voice for fear of upsetting her with more questions. Oh, they are more terrible than you could possibly imagine. But perhaps the cake would distract them. I'll have my husband, Mr. Butterpants, bring it out to the carriage for you, sir. Don't you worry. They will love your gift, said Mrs. Tittlebottom, rushing off to the kitchen in a panic. James narrowed his eyes as he watched the nervous woman rush off, and he wondered if he wasn't taking this part of his adventure seriously enough. James waited for more than an hour for the cake to be brought out, and when it was, he was surprised to see it was far larger than 6 layers, and adorned with a menagerie of marzipan animals. James had never seen such a cake not even in the halls of royalty back in London. It was so massive they had to bring it out with its own horse-drawn cart. This is my husband, Mr. Butterpants. He will follow along behind your carriage, sir, and help with the delivery of the cake. But he won't go into the dead woods, not for anything. It's a dead place, sir, ruled by necromantic witches. Horrible things have happened there, said Mrs. Tittlebottom. James hardly knew what to say. He didn't dare ask why their husband and wife didn't share a last name, but then he supposed they did things differently in this land. While this is truly the most magnificent cake I have ever beheld, don't you think it's a bit much? Mr. Butterpants and Mrs. Tittlebottom shook their heads. No, sir. The sisters love their cake, and it's best to make them happy, said Mr. Butterpants. There was an unmistakable look of nervousness on both of their faces, and James had the sinking feeling he had thrown their day into chaos by the mere mention of the Odd Sisters. He wondered what he was getting himself into. He was all pretty laughable, the idea of bringing such a large cake, but he decided to just go along with it. If these witches loved cake so much, then why not bring the biggest and made by the most renowned bakers in the many kingdoms? Surely that would impress them and make them more agreeable to helping him find Neverland. Thank you for everything. This is truly a splendid cake. But please, let me give you something more. What I paid you doesn't even cover the cost of ingredients, James said, pulling out more gold coins from his pocket. No, it's our pleasure, sir, said Mr. Butterpants. But James insisted, putting the coins into his hand. Thank you, Mr. Butterpants and Mrs. Tittlebottom. Wish me luck, James said as he got into his carriage, waving as it pulled away, wondering what the rest of the day would bring.